The speaker for this morning's session is Dr. Lowell G. Montgomery, who is the head pathologist at Ball Memorial Hospital. Dr. Montgomery received his undergraduate and medical degree at Manitoba, Canada in 1929. He did his postgraduate training at Mayo Clinic. He came to Muncie in 1934, from which time he has been head pathologist at Ball Memorial. His topic today is what is cancer, and he said he was going to try to tell us what cancer is through a definition, through it as a community problem, through research, through what it does and what it is. Dr. Montgomery.
Thank you very much. I'm always delighted to come over here and have a chance to talk to you folk, because you're the people that are going to be setting the patterns among your students in the next few years, and we like to see the patterns established in a way that is going to be most productive. The subject of cancer always comes to the hands of a pathologist, and I thought possibly I might tell you briefly and why. Some of you know, I'm sure, that I want you to know also what a pathologist is, because this is a very important part of the reason why I'm here and why I'm going to talk as I am this morning. A pathologist is a student of disease. He specializes in the study of disease. Now you say all doctors do. Well, we do it in a very definitive way in the laboratory as a result of the scientific measurements and examinations of all kinds. Pathologists started out as examiners of the dead bodies to find out why they died. So postmortem pathology was really the beginning of pathology. Then as we found out why people died, we began to find out that there were things that we should know about them while they were still alive that were productive. For instance, once we began to be able to operate on people after anesthesia came along, we began discovering that there were surgical conditions which the pathologist was able to analyze and get in a usable form for the surgeon, so that he could approach his surgical cases with a lot more assurance than he otherwise could. So that produced what is known as the surgical pathologist. We have the postmortem pathologist and then the surgical pathologist. Now the pathologists began to do various kinds of tests in the laboratories that they conducted, chemical tests of various kinds, microscopic tests of various kinds, and out of that came what is known as laboratory medicine or clinical pathology. Now the modern pathologist is all three of these. For instance, I spent the morning up until about 9:30 doing an autopsy. I started about 7:30 and finished it before I left. Then I went up to surgery, and the reason why I'm late was that I was called up to surgery to make like a surgical pathologist. When I get back, I'm going to be asked a lot of questions about the tests on patients in the hospital, and then I will be a clinical pathologist. Now this is sometimes subdivided, so a pathologist will do one or the other, or two of them. Now, why is it that we are particularly interested in cancer? Well, the reason is that cancer is one of the major diseases that afflict mankind. And it's getting to be a more and more important disease as we learn more about it and as we learn possibly some of the approaches to control of cancer. Now, just as an example, here is a microscopic section that I spent a while on yesterday afternoon at home, and it has on it a cancer of the lung, and we'll come back to that. A section from a cancer of the lung. If it had not been for this section, we would not be able to tell that this patient had a cancer of the lung. One of the things that we frequently are asked to do is to examine bits of lungs from patients who have been examined by a surgeon, and who send us a little piece, a so-called biopsy, or a piece of a living tissue. And from that we decide whether the patient has a cancer or does not have a cancer. This makes a great difference, of course, not only in the outlook for the patient, but in the way the surgeon or the clinician approaches the care of this particular case. Just as an example of how important cancer is, Every day, one of the pathologists at the hospital gets a tray of a whole flock of these slides from the cases that have been operated the day before. And from those, there are always a certain number of them that are cancers. Just no day passes. Well, this is, of course, one of the reasons why it is that I'm talking to you, because cancer is really a very, very important subject for all of us, not only personally, but as community, people in the community, and as students of disease. Here is the reason, really. I'm sorry I don't have my landing slides. I didn't bring any landing slides along with me, but you can tell, I'm sure, from this chart. In 1900, these are the 8 major causes of death in the order of frequency: tuberculosis, pneumonia, diarrhea and enteritis, heart disease, stroke, kidney disease, accidents, and cancer. That was in 1900. Now, you see, we've done away with one after another of these by public health measures, by new medications, by various kinds of control of water supply, and modern medicine, in other words, has simply reoriented the major causes of death. And as a result of this, heart disease, for which we still don't have any very good treatment, has taken first place, and cancer has taken second place. Now, second place in the causes of death is pretty important. And how important it is, I think we should introduce into the record. Out of every 3 families in the United States, 2 of them will encounter cancer of one kind or another. Out of every 4 people in any group, you included, 1 of every 4 persons in this room will develop cancer, ultimately. Now, you won't all die of it, fortunately, because we know how to cure many cancers. But some of you will. And so it's just really important when 25% of a nation faces almost certain exposure to this disease. That means that about 45 million people in this country who are now living in this country will get cancer, ultimately. And 275,000 of them are going to die this year of cancer. That means that approximately 725 people will die today of cancer, and tomorrow, and every day in the year. Now, this, I'm not trying to frighten you, I'm just trying to give you facts. And without these facts, we're not as well able to face life, and particularly to face the responsibilities of teaching people. They'll ask you questions. Your students will ask you questions. The people in your community will ask you questions. You are going to be leaders in your community, and so you should be well informed as possible. Well, with that as a reason for being here and some background to lend a verisimilitude to my being here as a pathologist, I want to talk to you about the actual condition itself. What is cancer? Does anybody really have a neat answer to that? Anybody in the room? I'd be curious to know if you have. It's just cancer is simply a disorder of growth, and that's all it is. Now, that's a pretty simple statement, but it contains an enormous amount of complexity. What is it that makes the growth alter, and what are the factors involved? A friend of mine, many years ago, decided that there should be a cancer institute for research in his community of Philadelphia. And he went out and raised the money by playing the piano, incidentally, and persuading his friends and the musical people of the community to pay large sums for hearing him play. It was worth hearing, by the way. And with the $1 million which he raised, he built a cancer institute, which was one of the first of this sort in the country. When it was open and going, he invited the people that had put up the money to come and see it. And they were astonished to find, when they went in, that the place was almost completely filled with rooms filled with vegetables of various kinds growing, particularly onions. I suppose most of you know that onion roots are the very best place to watch mitosis going on. And so he used that almost to the exclusion of any other kind of mitotic division for testing the substances on the periodic table and their compounds of various kinds and their relationship to growth. And this was the basic research which was carried on there for many years, and as far as I know they still continue to do it. And out of this research came almost everything we know. Out of that type of basic research came almost everything we know about the chemical control of cancer. We'll come back to that in a few minutes. But this is how important it is, how important the subject of how growth occurs, how important that subject is to the whole subject of cancer. Because, as you know, there are cancers that grow fast and there are cancers that grow slowly. There are cancers that stay in one place and there are cancers that spread throughout the body. And the reason why they do these things in different ways is because of differences in their growth patterns and in the ways in which we can control those growth patterns, because we can to some extent. Now, as you know, we all start out as one cell which becomes fertilized with another cell, and then the whole animal is produced by this fertilized single cell. Now, what is it that causes this cell to grow in the type of way that it does to produce a more or less orderly individual ultimately? And what is it that keeps it from being lopsided? What is it that keeps it from doing all kinds of strange things? Well, we know as a result of some of our teratogenic research that and misfortunes that chemicals of various kinds can cause disorder in this orderly, more or less orderly arrangement of growth. And we are vigorously pursuing that type of research. But it is fantastic, isn't it, that we just get enough cells of one kind to make a liver here and a spleen there and a lung here and a heart there, and that they all find a more or less usual place to go in the individual as they develop. Well, if we were all made up of cells like that, we wouldn't have any problem. But a cancer cell doesn't respond to the normal controlling mechanism. In some way, it loses its direction. And it loses it, well, let us say tumors of all kinds lose their direction, more or less. And when they lose it almost completely, then they're cancer. When they lose it in only a regional way, and you just get a lump in one place, which is not cancer. Nobody knows, for instance, why it is that there may be a benign tumor of the breast, which is one that I just did my examination on in the operating room a few minutes ago, or was it going to turn out to be a cancer of the breast? They look exactly the same, often, except under the microscope. You can tell the difference. Well, that's really the problem. I had a daughter once who, when she was 4 or 5 years old, came to me. Well, she didn't come to me. She was sitting at the breakfast table having been urged to eat her porridge so that she would grow up to be a big girl. And she looked despondently at the porridge and she said, "How do I know when I get to be the right size?" Well, that's a nice point. I think it's really pretty fundamental. How does this cell that's going to make a liver know when it has made a liver that's just right for that individual? Well, I saw a liver this morning at this autopsy that was full of pieces of tissue that didn't know what they were doing. They had just gone wild. And they were replacing the liver as rapidly as they could. And they had come from the lung. And in the lung was a cancer about so big. And we'll come back to that a little bit later. Now, one of the things that I think will have dawned on you if you didn't know it already, and that is that since cancer is a disorder of growth, it can occur in any tissue. And this is a very important thing to know and to remember, because every time you read in the newspaper or hear on the radio that there's a cure for cancer, you can be absolutely sure that it's wrong, because there are so many different kinds of cancer that you can never, in the foreseeable future, in the framework of the knowledge that we now have, we never can have a cure for cancer, because it would be a cure for 175 or 250 different kinds of different conditions. Now, we know almost 100% cure for one very, very violent kind of cancer, and it's a chemical. It's a hormone. But that's as far as I can think, that's the only cancer that we have a sure chemical cure for. And that happens about once in 250,000 people, so it isn't a very important type of cancer. But if we had a cure for a specific kind of cancer, that's about as far as we could expect to go. For instance, even a cancer of the lung, quote unquote, consists of many different kinds of cancer. And we know for sure that some of these are a lot more easily controlled than others. Now, I say controlled because we still don't know how to cure cancer of the lung, except for one thing, and that is to remove the lung with the cancer in it, or the part of the lung. Now, you've been talking about quackery, and this is the place where the quacks thrive. And that is in the area where they can say that they're going to cure, or they know a cure for cancer. And you can be sure that anybody that says this is either misled or is deliberately trying to mislead you or the public. Now, nobody really knows what happened in the Krebiazin fiasco, but I'm absolutely sure that Dr. Ivy, the scientist involved, was misled, because Dr. Ivy was one of the great scientists of the world when he became deluded by these folk that said that they had a cure for cancer. I suppose some of you don't know about it, but I think most of you do know in general the way about this national furor that's been going on for years around a so-called cancer cure that turns out to be just a very simple chemical that has no power over cancer at all. Well, what do we do with cancer? What can we do with it? Does anybody know the answer to that? There's only one thing to do. That's get rid of it. Take it out completely. Because if you don't get it all out, that's one of the things about cancer that is so disastrous, and that is that even one cell, or a few cells anyway, can grow into a new cancer if you take all the rest out. So you have to remove it completely. And of course, this is one of the reasons I think you can easily see why cancer of the skin is almost 100% controllable. Because you can see it, the surgeon can see it clearly, and he can see its outlines, and he can remove it completely. If a surgeon can remove a cancer by a surgical means, then that patient, for all intents and purposes, is just like the next person. Except for one possibility, and that is that we still don't know whether they have within them, the person who has one cancer, has within them some sort of defect or some sort of disarray of their physiological mechanisms that predisposes them to cancer. Now, this has not been evaluated, and don't hold me to it, but I do know that one of my confreres in the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology in Washington showed clearly a number of years ago, without any question, that a person who had a cancer of the skin was several times more likely to have a cancer elsewhere in their body than a person who didn't have a cancer of the skin. Now this is very odd, and nobody's ever been able to explain it. But of course, it's one of the many, many things that we know about cancer that we can't explain. Well, if we attempt to remove it, there are various ways of doing this, and surgery is one of them. You can either cut it out with a cold knife, just a scalpel, or you can burn it out, as many dermatologists do, with an electric cautery or an electrocoagulation. And you can also nowadays use light. The laser light beams are being used for this sort of thing experimentally. Of course, it doesn't matter what you use. If you can destroy the cancer completely, you've cured that cancer. Now, another way of destroying it, besides removing it chemically, removing it surgically, is by destroying it with X-ray, radiation. You can apply radiation either with radium or radioactive material of any kind. If it's appropriately radioactive, can destroy cancer cells. Now, sometimes they can destroy them completely. Quite possibly, most of the time. I don't want to be quoted on this because I don't know the percentages, and I don't think anybody else does. Radiation is not, of course, nearly as successful as surgical removal, because you never know for sure whether your X-rays are going to destroy your cancer cells. But when they do, then that person is cured also. Now, you can do it with cancers of the skin, and that was one of the early ways of destroying cancer of the skin. We know, as I've told you before, that there are chemicals which can, one chemical at least that we know can cure one kind of cancer. And we keep striving, as my friend did, to find other kinds of chemicals that will do something that is fantastically miraculous, it seems to me. And that is, the person takes this chemical, whatever it is, into their body, or it's put there by the physician. And then these chemical molecules search out the cancer cells and destroy them and leave their neighbors, the normal cells, untouched, or at least relatively untouched. Now you see why it is that chemical treatment of cancer is so enormously more difficult than the removal by just simply removing the tumor, because you have a very twilight zone between killing the patient and killing the cancer. And I can assure you that many of these chemicals are very, very difficult to apply. But we keep trying. As a result of this, just as an example of a type of cancer which is a highly specialized one and quite different from most others, that is leukemia. We have been able, by chemical means, to protract the lives of acute leukemias by sometimes several years. Now, none, as far as I know, has ever been cured. But children that previously would die in a few weeks have been many times brought back to what appeared to be perfect health and have gone to school and lived a normal life until their disease finally caught up with them. We hope, as time goes on, that we will find more and more discriminating chemicals which will protract this period. Finally, we hope someday to protract it indefinitely. Then we keep hearing some very interesting things that are coming out of modern research that has been stimulated very appreciably in the last few years by efforts at organ and tissue transplants. We have discovered a great amount of facts and potential lines of research that have to do with the body's ability to create immune mechanisms toward foreign tissue. or in some cases towards their own tissues. Now, you know that if we take a foreign material into our body, of certain types of foreign material, these materials create antibodies in us as a protective mechanism. Sometimes it's not very protective, but that seems to be its biological reason. Well, we know for sure by looking at the sections, a section like this, I can tell that the tissues that are adjacent to the cancer are reacting to that cancer in a certain way. And sometimes they react in such a way that the cancer cell is destroyed, and you can see it being destroyed in the microscopic section. Well, if we knew how to control that tendency for the normal tissues to destroy the cancer tissues, we would have a very effective mechanism which we could stimulate, possibly, to increase its destructive tendencies. This is not a pipe dream by any means, because it's going on all the time. I just cut this out of a newspaper, a medical newspaper, yesterday, dated July the 31st, from Melbourne, Australia. They are there working on efforts to try and produce specific antibodies against cancers. Now, as I mentioned, the quacks enter into this region of trying to mislead people who have cancer, or who have friends or relations that have cancer. And although you may feel that almost anybody that has an idea that might work is worth listening to, it is one of the most horrible miscarriages of efforts to save lives, to see some of the things that are done in the name of cancer cures. This is not, fortunately, so common nowadays as it used to be, but practically every community when I was a young boy had within it a cancer quack, somebody that would cure your cancer. And so we see still appearing every once in a while someone that tries to do this, or at least tries to let on that they're doing it. One of the things that I think is very important for us to think about as far as cancer is concerned is what can we do about preventing it? Because that's modern medicine, isn't it? Curing a disease is well and good, and that's medicine as most of us used to think of it. But if you can keep a person from becoming ill with any disease and keep them in good health, this is the ideal accomplishment of medicine and society in general. And I want to just spend a few minutes on this subject, because I think this is a place where teachers in general have a responsibility. One specific responsibility. I want to, before I run out of time, I want to take a few minutes to tell you something that I always tell to classes of teachers wherever I see them, and students wherever I can, and that is, there's only one cancer that we know how to prevent almost 100%, and that's cancer of the lung. Now, there are exceptions to this, of course, because cancers can grow in any tissue. Apparently de novo, without any stimulus that we know of. But we positively know what causes cancer of the lung in almost 95%, I guess, between 95 and 96% of cancers, I would say, are caused by one thing, and that's smoking cigarettes. The use of tobacco in general, but cigarettes in particular. Now, I I'm sure that I'm unpopular with some of my audiences because of the fact that there's a strong public sentiment to look critically at this statement. And I don't know why, because for the first time in the history of medicine, we know positively what causes a cancer that is destroying the lives of a large proportion of the most productive people in our communities. We know positively what causes it. And what effect has it had? Not a single solitary thing has happened. Now, I want to, in the next few minutes, I want to impress on you how important this is. Until very recently, and I mean within less than 20 years, we didn't know what caused cancer of the lung. We knew that it was increasing rapidly. In the 30s, we have already had noticed this. When I came here first in 1934, cancer of the lung was a rarity. If I had a case, I would report it in the literature. And now, no day goes by that I don't see a case of cancer of the lung, and I just finished, as I told you, doing an autopsy on one, and the day before yesterday I did an autopsy on autopsies on two cases of cancer of the lung, and there are half a dozen cases dying in the wards of the hospital right now of cancer of the lung. Now, here's what's happened. All deaths have been going down a bit since in the last 30 years, since 1930 to 1960. There's a slight decrease in all the overall death rate. All cancers have been going up slightly during that time. Now, here is what happened to cancer of the lung. From practically zero, cancer of the lung has risen, and not only risen in a straight line, but in an increasing line. Now, this is cancer of the lung in general, but if you take men only, you can just move it up like that. If you take women, you can move it down a little bit and move it over, because the women are doing exactly the same thing, but 20 years after. And it's almost certain that the same pattern of rapid rising death rate from cancer of the lung will be true of women. The patient that the person that I autopsied this morning was a woman who had smoked continuously since she was a young girl. She was 75 years old, and she had a far advanced, widespread cancer of the lung. I can remember when a cancer of the lung was never heard of in a woman, except for the occasional one, which apparently is on a different type of basis. Now, somebody over here at the university asked me a while ago to let them see a cancer of the lung. They're not very easy to see for one reason or another, because they are usually involved in a lot of fibrous tissue, and they're distorted in such a way that you can hardly tell where the cancer is. But I have here a cross-section of the mediastinum, the part of the chest that stands between the two lungs and over the heart, and this is solid cancer coming from one of the lungs. Now you can see why this patient had difficulty breathing, because there's their trachea right in the center of this solid mass. It's just like rubber. And you can see why the patient had difficulty swallowing, because there's their esophagus buried in the cancer. This is all this patient was complaining about, not being able to swallow, strangely enough. You can see why this patient had heart trouble, because their aorta, this is the arch of the aorta, is going through a solid block of cancer. You can see why the patient couldn't speak very well, because the nerves that control the vocal cords are buried and strangled by this cancer. Now, this patient had smoked 2 packages or more of cigarettes a day since he was about 6 years old or something like that. He was a childhood starter. And it's surprising how often these chain smokers start when they're little tads. This patient didn't have very many symptoms, as I say, he came in because he wasn't able to swallow and he was having difficulty speaking. But actually, his cancer had not got to the stage where it was very noticeable from the standpoint of his lungs. Well, now, let us go back a little bit now to how does this happen? And I think this will point out the mechanism of what is cancer. How does it come about? What is it that makes the cell decide to grow wildly instead of orderly? The reason, apparently, is that the cell becomes stimulated in some way. And in the case of the lung, the cells become stimulated by the tobacco smoke. Sure.
Dr. Montgomery, one of the groups of people will have to leave right now, and we can continue with that.
Fine. All right. One of the ways in which we know that this goes on, and that the cancer of the lung doesn't just pop up of its own accord, is that we can see in the lung of any smoke the changes that precede the growth of cancer. This is so universally true that a pathologist that has become accustomed to looking for this can see it practically 100% in smokers of any degree. And I think one of the best ways that I've ever seen this demonstrate the specific effect that does things to the cells of the lungs is a very short moving picture which was I think done at Northwestern University of a culture of the epithelium, the lining cells of the bronchial tubes, which are characteristically cells, fairly large cells like that, diagrammatically, with cilia on it. As you probably know, the inside of the lung is lined in considerable part by cells like this which have cilia on them, which are useful in cleaning out the debris that is in the air that's inhaled. And of course, when the person smokes, these cilia also attempt to remove the foreign material that comes in with the smoke. And one of the things that we can see as evidence of the fact that the cell has something happening to it when it's exposed to the tobacco or tobacco products was shown in this film, in which the culture contained globules of these cells. For some reason that I'm sure nobody knows, they tend to grow in balls, containing maybe 100 or 200 of these cells, and on the outside their cilia present. And so the culture contains quite a few of these, in addition to the individual cells, these units of organized cell clusters. And they, because their cilia keep on working in the culture, they go round and round. I don't know why they go in the particular direction they go, but they do. Revolve constantly in one direction. And so someone conceived the idea of exposing them to tobacco products, and they introduced into the culture medium more or less of the condensed smoke from tobacco. And as soon as the tobacco products were introduced into the culture, these cilia started to become disorganized in their motion, and the rotation of the mass slowed down and finally stopped. And as it stopped, the cilia became limp, and the whole thing became inactive. Well, this is just one evidence of the fact that there is within the tobacco a substance which is destructive to the function of the cells. Well, apparently that doesn't create cancer of itself. But if you keep destroying cells that are highly organized, for instance, here, if this is a piece of the lining of a bronchus, one of the bronchial tubes, and these are cells of a highly specialized nature, such as the ciliated cells, and they become destroyed as a result of constant exposure to this toxic material. They become replaced with an entirely different type of cell, which is not nearly as specialized, and which doesn't, of course, have the functions that the ciliated cells have. And if these cells continue to be exposed to the toxic effects of tobacco, they tend to try to replace themselves in greater and greater numbers, and so they become not only just a single layer of cells, but multiple layers of cells. Now, it's easy to be phylogenetic in your thinking about these things, but it's a convenience to say that these cells are trying their best to protect the wall of the air tube and continue to do what has to be done, and that is make a lining. But if they're constantly being destroyed, they constantly are having to replace themselves. Now you see that anything that will disorder that growth pattern, and is already disordered because it's not normally carrying out its function of simply replacing the normal loss of cells, but it's carrying out an excessive function of replacing cells that have already been destroyed and replaced many times. Well, sometime along about then, whenever that is, about 20 years after massive exposure in the average case, let us say, something like that, one of these cells, or two or three of them, and we don't know how many, decide that they've had it. And so they just go wild. And that's a cancer. Now, this is an oversimplification, but apparently this is essentially what happens every place that we have been able to observe precancerous changes. Something stimulates the cell, and the cells respond to this stimulus in a more or less orderly way. First of all, in an orderly way, which is the normal replacement of our lost cells. Then in a more and more disorderly way, until finally, at a breaking point, for reasons which we have no idea about at the moment, the cell ceases to be even partly orderly in its response and becomes wild. And that is the subject of the most enormous amount of research at the present time. I brought along a book, a pamphlet, which has come across my desk recently from the National Cancer Institute, just a progress report on what is going on in cancer research now. And it's just fantastic, the amount of time and money and effort that's going into this subject, and out of it has come a great deal, of course, but still not what we're looking for, and that is some way of controlling cancer. And so it seems most extraordinary to me, and as a matter of fact to many, that we for the first time do have control of this one type of cancer, and yet we don't control it. I'm sure that some of you have seen the first report of the Advisory Committee to the Surgeon General on smoking and health. This was, I can't remember the exact date, but Luther Terry, who was then Surgeon General, introduced this into Congress, and it was widely disseminated. I don't seem to see the time, but it was about 5 years ago. And in this same newspaper that I took this clipping out of, there was a note that Dr. Terry is now in the process of producing another report and carrying on considerable investigation on a nationwide study of what's being done in every country. And just to top it off, I can tell you that there isn't a single study that's been done in any country in the world that hasn't shown exactly the same thing. I'm sure that my discussion has been a little less specific than some of the talks that you have had, because I felt that although it was you'd asked me to talk about the cause of cancer, what cancer is, to define it, that it was too good a chance to miss to tell you a few of the things that I have attempted to tell you about cancer. And particularly I wanted to give you as teachers a quick run over cancer of the lung, because I think that you as teachers can do a tremendous lot to control the thinking of your students. You can't do as much as they can at home, but all too commonly both of the parents smoke, and that's a problem. Problem to you, of course, and how to approach it. But you can't tell them that their mother and father shouldn't smoke, but you can tell them that they shouldn't start. And as you probably know, you have to start pretty early telling them that. Well, I think that's all I want to say to you this morning, except that I do want to, within the time limits that you have available, I would be glad to try and answer questions.